Welcome to the Secure CIO, the podcast for technology executives who are tasked with hiring and retaining great cybersecurity leaders. Join best-selling author Claire Pales together with industry thought leaders as they answer your questions about sourcing the right leaders, building cybersecurity teams, candidate selection, salaries, skills, and more.
Hello, I'm Claire Pales and welcome to the Secure CIO podcast. Today's guest is Darren Argyle. Darren is an accomplished executive with close to 20 years international cyber risk and security experience. He was recently appointed an ambassador for the Global Cyber Alliance in recognition of his collaboration work with small businesses. Darren is also currently serving on the Executive Advisory Board for Cyber at Deakin University and is the current Chief Information Security Officer at iCare, which is one of Australia's largest insurance organisations who cover Australian icons such as the Sydney Harbour Bridge and the Sydney Opera House. Darren is the former Group Chief Information Security Officer at Qantas Airlines and before coming to live in Australia, the former Chief Security Officer at IHS Markit, a global fintech headquartered in the UK. He's also held various senior international cybersecurity leadership roles at Symantec and IBM. In 2016, Darren featured on the front cover of SC Magazine, an award-winning cybersecurity media publication. Then, in 2017, he was named in the top 100 Chief Information Security Officers globally, and in 2018 was listed on the top 100 IT security influencers globally. This year, Darren co-founded and launched a new business called Cyber Resilience, which delivers executive cyber leadership programs to support the next generation of cyber leaders and emerging Chief Information Security Officers. Darren, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
So we've heard a little bit about you in your bio, but tell me a bit about how you got to this point in your career as a leader and what's driven you to be the co-founder of a cybersecurity platform in your spare time.
Yeah, well, thank you, Claire, and thanks for the introduction there. You sometimes listen to a bio and forget just how much you've achieved and the history of everything. So thanks for going through that. Yeah, so as I said in my bio, I've been in cybersecurity for over 20 years. And in that time, I've worked in various different roles, anything from an end user organization, starting off at a brewing organization called Whitbread in the UK, where the head of IT security there, to where I am now as a Chief Information Security Officer. But during that time, there's been some key points, I guess, in my career that's shifted my focus, that's led me to where I am today. And I guess, my first kind of in-depth role in IBM is where I really started to work with multiple organizations as we were working in the outsource era. So we were onboarding lots of large clients and large organizations looking to outsource at that time during the 2000s, early 2000s. And that's where I really began to learn about leadership more than just purely cybersecurity, because I managed to get to a team of plus 200. So at that stage, you're having to not only rely on your skills as a cybersecurity professional, but also learn about what's important of leading large teams. So that's when I learned, more about leadership. And I think in the early days, you tend to flounder up, you make mistakes, but that's how you learn, right? So, and then from that, I took various roles. One was in Symantec, which was more in-depth into a technical role again. And then I started on my journey as a Chief Information Security Officer when I was hired into a fintech in the UK, which was a global role. In there, I had to grow a team from scratch. So that was not only learning about applying my skills as a leader, but also how to build a team from scratch as well. And during that time, since then to now, I've worked with larger and larger teams in terms of cybersecurity. As a CISO and obviously evolved my skill as a leader. In parallel to working on this, I've always been interested in the startup world and looking at how we could apply the skills of cybersecurity startups into the world of cybersecurity. I've now started a company called Cyber Resilience, which I co-founded with two other partners. But this is more about the opportunity to give back in this startup, because this is more about building the next generation of cyber leaders, where I feel that I have an opportunity to help others become emerging CISOs become CISOs.
So it sounds like you've grown some pretty significant teams over your journey, and some, you mentioned more than 200 staff in some cases, and growing teams from scratch. what are your thoughts on the scope of security teams? So should they have every security member within that team and have a remit for every potential security outcome? Or should they be much more sort of focused and niche? What's been your experience and what are your thoughts on the scope?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it depends on the maturity of the organisation that wants to consume cybersecurity services, and I tend to think of it as capabilities. So, as an example, we know that security patching is one of the most important capabilities that you need in the cybersecurity function, but it doesn't necessarily have to be delivered by the security team. In fact, that's one area that's now become fairly automated. The management of the vulnerabilities to make sure that happens should sit with the security team, but the actual doing and applying of those security patches is better serviced by other areas of the organization. That, security patching is just another capability that they deliver, perhaps in the server management team or even the application management team. So I don't think the security team should do everything. I think, and also we've seen need to drive efficiencies as well. I think as security capabilities grow, you can become cumbersome and become a cost on the business. So I think you can even look at things like outsourcing capabilities where a great degree of automation and specialism is required. And I think an example of that, again, is something like managed security services, where there are billions of events that potentially are coming from the systems that need to be managed. I think in those instances, building a big in-house managed security services capability is only really viable if you're something like a big bank. I think probably most organisations don't have a significant amount of money to invest in an in-house capability. So I think that's better outsourced. And in my experience, I think because of the sophistication of the threats and the speed at which they accelerate across an organisation, I do believe actually that's better outsourced anyway to a specialist organisation, and retain things like cyber threat hunting and the overall management of incidents in-house, but that repetitive kind of response and even like log aggregation and management, outsource that as much as possible.
I mean, in terms of the advice that the team gives out, so scope, I guess, can also come from the perspective of what decision-making authority the team might have. Do you think the cybersecurity or information security teams should have a decision-making power, or do you think they're more of an advisory service to the business?
It's an interesting one, because when I first come into an organisation, you look at the kind of responsibilities and accountabilities. I don't see the security, the CISO role, for example, or the most senior role being accountable, but I certainly see them being responsible. And there's a difference there, because the accountability is the accountability for the risk typically, and that should sit with a senior executive. So sit with the CEO, but delegated to another executive who sits in that C-suite. And really the cybersecurity or the chief security officer role is really more there to advise on the risk, and the accountability of what we should do with that risk sits with the business and ultimately the CEO of the business. So I don't think that decision-making authority finally should sit with the chief security officer, in my opinion. I think that accountability sits elsewhere. It's only our responsibility to articulate the risk and let others make the decision about what they want to do within risk appetite. And this is crucially where risk appetite becomes an important component part of the discussion. If that's defined up front, and you might even have multiple risk appetites across the business, then the business is making the decision, because quite frankly, some businesses want to move very fast and accept more risk, whereas others don't. And that's where risk appetite comes in. So we are there really to advise, and best practices, in terms of policies, is what everybody signs up to. So once those have been agreed, everybody's got a fair idea of what should be applied across the business, and that should help with the decision making of those executives who have to make the final decision.
Yeah, I think you make a good point that the security team can't really operate in isolation. There's a lot of work that goes on around the organisation around risk management, risk acceptance and risk appetite that really drives what the security team is able to achieve and kind of drives the advice that they might need to give at any given time.
Yeah.
I guess the other question around scope would be not only decision-making and the types of people that are in the team. But this idea around a converged model, so bringing all the security practices under one umbrella, the physical security side, the cyber, information security, corporate security, and in some cases even fraud. I mean, do you see a converged model as the way that organisations are going, where someone like yourself might end up as a CSO, a Chief Security Officer, as opposed to the current state where there's a lot of CISOs, and really kind of bringing in corporate security and physical security under that converged umbrella? Do you see that as the direction that we're going?
It's interesting, is that because we are certainly seeing that direction going for a lot of organisations, but we're also seeing the converse of that as well, which is devolving cybersecurity into the organisation. And I'll just give one example, then come back to the CSO. So if you look at Facebook, for example, they no longer have a chief security officer. They've devolved or are devolving much of their security back into the organisation. So cybersecurity becomes part of everybody's role. And I think that's probably where the future's going to go. But I think back to your question right now, I think we are in a situation certainly where it's being brought together under one head. And if I think about my role in Qantas, for example, I reported to the chief security officer, who was largely responsible for the physical security of the organisation, and in Qantas was, more senior within that organisation. And I was sitting in an IT capability, so there was a dotted line into the chief security officer. So in that role, he was responsible for cybersecurity, and certainly we've seen that happening. So you are seeing some CISO roles underneath the chief security officer, and I think that's largely because existing chief security officers don't necessarily have the cyber experience or skills, so there you're having to have the chief security officer reporting to them. But we are seeing examples, even in Australia, where you do have a chief security officer who came from a CISO role, that was his original title, was given the physical security and then became the chief security officer. I think that works in a large enough organisation where you have a good physical security capability, but asking for a chief security officer to have cyber skills, physical security skills, I think is quite a leap for that role. But having brought them both together, it does certainly elevate the role and gets them much better heard, I think, in the C-suite, which we know we're still finding is a challenge for the CISO role today. But I think it's about being able to support a big enough role. I don't see existing traditional security officers who have a physical background being able to make the leap to technical, and is still a requirement. So you're still going to see, I think it's more likely the CISO will become a chief security officer rather than chief security officers becoming technical.
I mean, I think you make a good point that those types of roles are probably more likely to exist in a much bigger organisation where, those different security pillars are, if not already established, or already a requirement. If you think about some of the smaller organisations and maybe some of the experience you've had in building teams from scratch, I mean, when you first come into a new organisation that doesn't have an established security function, how do you prioritise the type of team that you put around you, and what do your hiring priorities become? Who do you hire first, do you think? Or who have you hired first?
Yeah, so, I know exactly. So that happened in IHS Markit, and I arrived in an organisation that had little or no security capabilities at all. And I think what most security officers, chief security officers, will do is, like I did, was literally look at their own skill sets and then look for skills to complement that. So although I've got a good technical background, I would not say that I'm an enterprise security architect. So for me, the first role I would always employ is an enterprise security architect. And it has to be a really good one who thinks about business first and technology second. So that's a key role that I've always looked for in a team that I've moved into, to an existing security team, or if I was to build a team from scratch, it's the first role that I would hire. And then secondly, once I've hired that key role, I would also look to not necessarily hire an individual, but look to a local boutique security consulting firm. And I've always found this has worked particularly well because then you're able to augment your team by using a consulting boutique firm. And if it's one that's local, they know the local environments. I'm not talking about going for a global capability or even a big four, but look for a local boutique organization, probably around size of about 20 to 30. So there's some strength and depth in that pool of people. And that way you can get those skills quickly to answer questions quickly. And then as you grow your team, the various roles and responsibilities, you can release some of that headcount back into your own team rather than using the boutique. But it's a way of accelerating the skills required in an organization at a time when you need them most, because hiring can take some time. And that's one thing I have learned, that hiring can take months and months, and then even when you land the perfect person, they can be snatched away from you. So then you have to go through the process again, and that lengthy process of hiring leaves an organization, leaves you as the CISO exposed, but ultimately leaves the organization exposed. So the sooner that you can engage in a local boutique security consulting firm, the better, I think.
Sort of based on that process, do you think that there are some particular roles that you could leave in that outsourced model, and there are other particular roles that you would always be seeking to eventually hire permanently?
Yeah, I think the roles that lend themselves well to being outsourced are managed security service capabilities. Log aggregation and log management. A lot of organisations have spent a lot of time building up a SIM capability using something like Splunk or various other technologies that are out there. But that the building out of that capability takes time, and then you need to manage it, and you have the in-house specialist skills. So for me, anything that you can purchase security as a service, I would always err on the side of as much as possible. So managed security services and all that entails is one example. Another one as well, I think that's important, is in-house kind of major incident response, breach response capabilities. You need that kind of, we need to be able to surge your capability at the time of a major breach. So having a retainer in place for major incident response, I think, is a really good idea, because you're not going to have people sitting around in your own team just waiting for a major breach to happen. So that's another area that I'd expect. And then there's the other areas that things like security patching and things that we've already talked about. Certainly have those roles existing in other teams, and try not to bring those in-house. So anything that can be automated or highly specialized, such as major breach response, you could certainly outsource. But the things like the security architecture, enterprise security architecture role, an operations manager capability role, they certainly need to be in-house.
What hurdles have you faced in sourcing the right people for your teams? And have you found across industries and across geographies, given that you've worked in a number of countries, do you find that the hurdles that you're presented with are different depending on which organisation or country that you're in terms of sourcing staff?
I mean, coming into Australia, I found it more challenging in finding the right skills and capability. I found certainly in Europe there was a much more diverse set of skills and skills and capabilities of individuals available to me. Certainly in Australia, I found that that's more challenging. I've also found that there's in Australia much more of a contractor culture, I would say, in Australia. I mean, I would say it was much easier to get the skilled personnel in the UK. I've tended to use specialist recruiters as well, and knowing the good ones is really important. So, and I think coming to Australia and not necessarily knowing who were the good recruiting consulting firms is a challenge. That's something that can slow you down. But building a relationship up in the UK, as I did over many years, I got to know which technical recruiters knew the right skills and capabilities and the individuals that you could quickly bring on board. Of course, the other thing that helps as well, if you've been living in one place for some time, you get to know the industry really well. You get to know the individuals really well, and the good players and the bad players, I guess, in various teams. So you can draw upon your previous teams that you've worked with and pull those into your organisation. coming to Australia, of course, you don't know that security industry. You don't know the security professionals that are out there. And actually, I think that puts or can put a senior security professional at a disadvantage in many ways coming to a new country if they don't know the existing pool of recruiters and the talent that's available in the local community. And I think if you're moving internationally to any location, that's a key thing to understand up front before coming to that country, whether that's spending some time understanding the talent that's available or engaging with the various recruitment organizations before actually landing in the country that you might be working in. I mean, these are all kind of, key lessons learned that you need to impart to people, because it's not something you would necessarily think of. But having the right team in place is crucially important. And, knowing the local environment, knowing the local teams, knowing the talent pools already can help you move much quicker.
I think there's a lot more desire to source staff from other countries at the moment, particularly because there's this so-called skills crisis that's going on. And, some people are firm believers that, we are down millions of people that we need to fill the cybersecurity roles, and others believe that there is no skills crisis. I'm interested to know what your thoughts are on the crisis, and also given that you've got cyber resilience and that offers leadership training, is that going to go some way to filling some of the skills gaps that we're experiencing globally?
So, yeah, it's an interesting one, the skills gap, isn't it? I think there's a huge amount of graduates coming out of university, with credible academic skills from what they've learned at the various universities. I also think we're also seeing, organisations like with me, training, ex-military personnel. So I think we're seeing a huge amount of work being done at the entry level. So I don't believe we've necessarily got a skills gap at that place. I think where we have got a skills gap is between those that have raised themselves up in terms of experience as a technical security person and are looking to move into that executive role. I think that's where we've got a significant gap in Australia, and I would suggest probably in most places around the world. And I think the reason for that is it's quite a different skill set to move from, say, a head of IT security with a good technical background to dealing with technology teams and even just dealing directly with the CIO, to suddenly then find yourself in the C-suite working with the business directly, the heads of business, the CEO and the board. Moving in those circles is very different to working with other technology teams to make sure the patches are fixed in the right time and making sure the user IDs are revalidated on a regular basis. Having a discussion with a board member is very different. And that was, one of the primary reasons for setting up, the cyber resilience business with my two partners in Australia was we recognized that, there's some great security certifications that you can achieve, such as CISSP and CISM, that require a good number of years in a profession before you could even take those qualifications. And the academic qualifications that you'll get, you've got MSCs and cybersecurity and various university qualifications that you can achieve right after school. But none are really addressing that real world experience. Learning from mistakes is one thing that we all do ourselves, but to learn from somebody else's mistakes is what can really accelerate people on that leadership path. And that's where I think we've got the biggest gap right now.
I definitely agree that it's really at those senior levels that there's an expectation that people have such a breadth of skills across so many different things. As you said, they need technical experience and technical knowledge, and then they also need to be able to take technical information and then deliver that to boards and audit and risk committees in a really a completely different language, and yet gaining that experience is very difficult. And what I've noticed is that a lot of organisations are advertising for these senior leaders who, many might call unicorns because, they have, that they've really got experience in so many facets. I mean, what are your thoughts around that? And what advice would you give to an organisation who putting a job description out in the market that really appears that this one person has to be a jack of all trades.
I think, Claire, that is certainly the challenge that we've got today. And you think you're right, you are almost looking for the unicorns. I think, obviously, if you are looking for a seasoned chief information security officer, there are only so many available out there. So you might have to take a leap of faith, and if it's a smaller organisation, go for somebody who isn't a chief security officer, but certainly being a head of information security in some capacity, managing and leading even a small team. But then they need to focus on what do they look for in the interview process. And I think the interview process then is more about focusing on the communication skills of that individual and really just focus the interviews on that, and almost taking a given that the individual has the technical skills and capability. And I think they need to prioritise their skills as well in those job descriptions. Saying this is essential and this is, critical, and it becomes challenging to understand what is the most important skills required for that role. I think they also need to recognise as well, if there's an existing team that has a good technical capability, then the CISO coming into that role might not necessarily need that skill set, but communication becomes the key skill. So I think organisations need to get better at prioritising what they want. And the way they can do that, of course, is one, either speaking to peer organisations, speaking to other CISOs, I think would be a really good start, rather than just immediately jumping to a headhunter organisation or executive search, and speak to some of those peers and say, how would you write this job description, rather than just jumping straight into an executive search. But certainly writing a job description without any experience of what's required of the role, nobody advising that organisation, I think, is a recipe for disaster. So because you'll just be searching and not find the right person. And I think the other thing as well is, certainly when interviewing for that role, it is about even getting them to speak to the board. If you've got to have them, the interview process include a board member, so that they can understand, not only to meet the board and ask questions of the board member, but also get the board to ask those typical questions they'd ask in a boardroom, and find out how the candidate answers those questions. And that's much better way of doing it. And that I had that exact experience at Market, where I was interviewed by the CEO, all the business leaders and the executive, and at least 2 board members before I was offered the position. So I think that's a wise thing to do.
I think putting the candidates into a position that's true to life is so important, because interviews can be very isolated interviews and in isolated discussions, really, that if you don't inject some everyday life and, as you said, bring in board members, bring in senior leaders, bring in some of those key stakeholders they're going to have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, at least that way they'll have that exposure, and they're interviewing the organisation as much as the organisation is interviewing them.
Absolutely.
So once they're exposed to those people, maybe they might make the decision that actually this is not for me, or actually this makes me even more motivated to want that role.
I think there's a lot that people coming in for those roles can do to help themselves. In every organisation, any role that you go for today, there's a lot of emphasis put on the kind of 90, 100-day plan. So what is that 90, 100-day plan for a chief information security officer? What are those key things that you should be doing before you arrive in the organisation? The first 30 days you should have achieved, and the first 60 days you should have achieved. So it's almost having candidates come into those interviews armed and knowing what's required of that role themselves. And, that takes some experience to know what that 90-day plans is. But I think that's an important piece, because then it allows the candidates to ask questions of the organisation and not be on the back foot during an interview process.
I want to have a quick chat about diversity, which is a very loaded word these days. And you mentioned earlier the great organisation With Me that looks at military service officers and how they can integrate into regular society. And I think from a diversity perspective, they offer a lot. There's obviously gender diversity, there's diversity of thought. What role does diversity play, if any, in some of your hiring and sourcing plans? And do you think there are any particular demographics or style of leaders that are really well suited to security leadership roles?
I don't think there's any one demographic or even type of gender that would be suited to a senior role. I think what is important is for a senior leader to be successful in those roles is to recognise diversity. So diversity of skill set is probably a big one for me. Recognising that the security competency skill set might not be the primary skill set required of that role. And I'll give you a good example. If you look at security awareness and culture programs, you've only got to look at the hiring in that space now in many organisations. They're coming from backgrounds in media, news, HR, other communications teams that are not necessarily, from security. These people don't have security expertise, but they're really good at communicating. And then another one that I see as well is that when hiring people into your team, don't necessarily think you need to look outside the organisation. There could be some great business leaders who understand a lot about the business, which is vital to a security function. Then the diversity there is about not necessarily, again, going for the security skills outside. It's looking internally for business leaders. But I think I've managed global international teams, truly global international teams, working all hours at the night to make sure that you're across all the different geographies. And I think what's important in those geographies is that you have the local people understand the local culture. So it's not necessarily, for example, when I was living in the UK, that I hire somebody in the UK and then ship them out to India to work or ship them out to Germany to work. It's about finding the people in those local geographies with the relevant skill sets and making sure that they are skilled enough to be able to do the role. But taking the time to actually find the right skills in those geographies. So that's really important as well, but not necessarily transporting skills from one location around the world. Obviously, with diversity now, we're seeing women being elevated in the role of cybersecurity, which is great. I mean, I think that the way we can all help as security professionals in that is do much more mentoring. Mentoring is a big thing for me. I mean, I've got a real life case study, I guess, of where mentoring has been successful for the person who I mentored. She was a graduate who I hired into IBM many years ago now, and I've continued to mentor her in the various roles that she's moved in and out of IBM and moved to different organizations, and even the roles that I've been in. So we've kept in contact. And that mentoring has allowed her to become a Chief Information Security Officer in a company in the UK. And she's been doing that role successfully now for the last, just over 2 years. And I do believe that mentoring has really helped her in that role, where others may have seen a barrier to a woman moving into that role and moving up this seniority. And she's done very well and thrived. So I think we can do much more of that to give women, and even many from other ethnic backgrounds, the confidence to put themselves forward into these senior roles. Because if you don't see a role model who's done that role previously, it's hard to see yourself being successful. And I think that's where mentorship helps. Of course, we're seeing now women Chief Information Security Officers growing in number right across the world. So that will certainly help women as well.
I think mentoring and that type of support that we can give each other in the industry goes a long way to making sure that our industry is healthy. And as you mentioned earlier, there are people coming in who have a variety of skill sets. And the more you can talk about your own experiences and help others, like the woman that you just mentioned, the more likely it is that we'll be able to solidify the skills that we need and grow these leaders sort of from the ground up, from graduates. And they say that those types of experiences, you can't get them out of a textbook. So, to be able to share like that, I guess I'm interested to know, have you ever shared or do you continue to share with her your mistakes as well as your successes?
Well, Claire, I think anybody that knows me well enough will know that that's one of the things that I talk about most. And in fact, I've shared my failures much more openly, I think, than probably most people. I think I even did a presentation at the Information Security Forum in Europe a few years ago, and the presentation was largely on all the things I'd made mistakes on. And I got more kind of hands shaken and congratulations at the end of it than I've ever had in any presentation, just for the sheer openness that I thought was important. Because people often tend to talk about all the great things that they've done and are less willing to share about all the things that haven't gone quite so well. If you're in a role and you're thriving, people just assume that you've done everything right. But I think it's quite the opposite. You've got the experience through making mistakes, obviously learning quickly and bouncing back from those. But and I think that's where certainly this woman that I mentored in the UK found it most helpful, because even when she had made a mistake herself, which both of us hadn't anticipated, she wondered what she could do to bounce back. And I think that's where mentors become important, is to think about, okay, this bad thing has happened, but why don't you take this approach? Because something similar happened to me in this situation, so try this. And I think that's because it's usually never career ending, although sometimes these things can be. But it's just knowing how you can kind of build that personal resilience. And I think that's a key thing for chief information security officers these days, is not only having skills and, talk about communication skills and everything else, but having some level of personal resilience when things don't go wrong or things don't go right. And you're under huge amounts of stress, for example, when there's a major breach is happening and all eyes are on you for the answers. So yeah, that's where mentorship comes in, really important.
I think having a mentor and being a mentor are huge contributors to the growth of teams and the evolution of some of these amazing leaders that we see today. And having access to people like that is so important. And you really have to go out in search of those people. They're not often just handed to you on a platter. Yeah. Early in your career, what do you wish you had have known about building teams when you started? If you could have had a mentor or a leader back when you were first building teams in cyber or in security, is there anything that you wish you had have known back then that I guess would have helped you over the years?
Well, certainly getting a mentor earlier would have been the crucial thing to do, which I didn't do, and I only learned the importance of afterwards. That would have been the single biggest thing that would have helped me. But even a tribe of mentors, don't just think of one. It's one for maybe the role that you want to build yourself into, but also in skill sets that you find yourself weak in. So, for example, if financial management is something that you feel that you are lacking as a skill set, then find somebody who's really good at that, can help you with that. So it's not just about one, it's about having a tribe of mentors, I would say. The other thing I think as well, it's probably been the biggest learning for me as a leader, and something that I wish I'd learned about much earlier, was this ability to let go and delegate more. Trying to do everything yourself and acquire a skill at the level that you think you need in every competency or every capability area is simply just not sustainable. Certainly when you're working in technology where it's changing so quickly, it's just almost impossible to keep on top of every technology advancement. But what you can stay on top of is building a team, almost like an orchestra, if you like, of all those capabilities and skill sets of diversity and that can work together to bring about the greatest result, but they have to complement each other. So building a team that complements one another, being able to delegate more is probably the skill set that I wish I'd learnt about earlier, but certainly I'm much better at these days.
Darren, I really want to thank you so much for your time today, for sharing your thoughts, your experiences, and being part of the Secure CIO podcast. I really appreciate your time, and I know if people listening want to find you, they can find you on Twitter at D_Argyle and on LinkedIn, just looking for Darren Argyle. Yeah. In terms of cyber resilience, what's the best way for people to find out more about the leadership education that you've got on offer?
So yeah, certainly on the website, they'll be able to find more information. So that's cyberresilience.com.au. And also just reach out to me directly. I'm also happy to help with various forums that we're setting up on LinkedIn groups, Facebook for cyber resilience as well. So if you just search for cyber resilience, you'll find our organisation. But yeah, just reach out to me directly and I'll point you in the right direction. Happy to help.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Darren.
Okay, thank you, Claire.
That's all we have time for today. Thanks so much for listening. For more information on all our guests, check out the show notes at thesecurecio.com, where you can also find more information on the Secure CIO framework and sign up for my newsletter. If you loved the show, please subscribe to the podcast and feel free to leave me a 5-star rating. I'll see you next week.